the textual basis for the divinity of Jesus, whether it was in Isaiah or whether it was in the book of Psalms or whether it was an episode about Rachel or about David or the tons of parts of the Jewish Bible that they utilized, the usages did not hold up. And as Bloom calls one of these, which is the time that St. Paul calls on a text about the veil of Moses and uses it to show that already in the Old Testament, the Mosaic tradition was being represented as a kind of blindness. That reading of the veil of Moses from the Jewish Bible, as Harold Bloom calls it, was really a lie against the text. As I was reading Bloom, and there's another good, important book by a fellow named David Klinghoffer recently called Why the Jews Rejected Jesus. These two books are important books with very different perspectives, but coming to the same conclusion. The proof texts, the interpretive strategies, as I like to call them, used by the Christians, aroused not so much the scorn and darkness and cynicism associated with lawyers and also with Pharisees, in quotes. After all, Jesus was a Pharisee. Who were these Pharisees who were constantly negating sometimes the evidence of their own eyes in scornful ways? It was less a question of scorn or even rejection than it was a question of indifference, because Jesus simply was not fulfilling the most rudimentary prophetic necessities attributed to the Messiah in the older text. I think when you get to St. John, several decades after Jesus and the world had not come to an end, you find it a particularly acute difficulty for St. John to continue to offer the same explanations. And what goes on in a part of the paper where I emphasize St. John's text especially, what's going on in St. John is really a frontal attack on a long tradition of interpretation, so that he is as much as saying, well, you refuse to see Jesus in your older texts that you value and stick to. You refuse to see Jesus. The reason you refuse to see Jesus in those older texts is because you are intransigently fixated on a view of those texts which by now you should know has been surpassed. We not only don't like your rejection of Jesus, we also don't like your insistence on sticking to a certain textual tradition that leads you to that unfortunate conclusion. And this brings me very much to the main theme that I want to convey in the brief time I have about the conference itself, and one way in which Jewish lawyers today are making a contribution, and normatively have always made a contribution that is somewhat different perhaps from the approach of lawyers trained in the tradition, in the religious tradition that grew up because of this difference between old and new interpretive strategies. And that is that at least normatively, Jews have had through the years a greater interpretive allegiance to the good code than non-Jews, a greater interpretive allegiance to the good code. Now, I heard everything Professor Berger said, and there's a lot that we can talk about, but maybe we'll leave to the Q&A. Even in his many examples of halachic flexibility, he used a variety of very interesting terms, or reevaluations of texts, or extremely creative, goal-oriented interpretations by Jews of texts in order to suit certain humanitarian, economic, gender-based needs. You don't find the leap, the degree of departure from textual traditions that we find throughout the New Testament. There is a difference not only in degree, there is a difference in kind between the interpretive strategies mustered from time to time, in fact, probably very frequently, by Jewish interpreters of their sacred texts, and the strategies mustered, deployed as essential, as a part of their war, by writers like St. Paul and St. John. I think this plays into a millennial-long difference in approach to issues that have nothing to do with theology, or seemingly nothing to do with theology. And I want to give an historical example that I talk about towards the end of my paper. I'm skipping an awful lot about postmodernism. I think you and I differ a little bit about whether the postmodernists, in fact, have moved back towards a more Jewish model, whereas I see them from Derrida to Badiou to Paul de Man, who was my teacher, as in fact destabilizing textual meaning in a way that's precisely analogous to what the New Testament writers did with the Old. But I do want an example of Vichy, France, where what I call the overly flexible hermeneutic actually had substantial and tragic effects on people's lives within the community of Vichy. And I want to describe this to you. Because when I say that I think Jewish lawyers normatively show a greater interpretive allegiance to the good code, that is to say, a text that has been in existence not without flaws in most cases for many, many years, sometimes centuries, and has been received within a certain interpretive tradition, should not be traduced because there is some kind of emergency going on, or because all kinds of interpretive strategies are asking for this good code to be undermined or traduced. Precisely the paradigm that I find in the first century Christian texts.